Ich schwöre bei Gott,
the Almighty and Omniscient,
dem Allmächtigen und Allwissenden,
that I will speak the pure truth.
dass ich die reine Wahrheit sage, dass ich nichts verschweige.
When a man reaches the final moments of his life, the words he chooses to speak often carry a weight unlike anything else he has ever said. They are stripped of pretense, of pride, of ambition, and instead reveal the raw truth that even a lifetime of silence could not suppress. For Friedrich Paulus, the German field marshal, whose name became forever tied to one of the most brutal battles in human history, those final words stunned the world. To many, Paulus was remembered as the commander who led his army into the icy hell of Stalingrad, only to surrender in what became one of the most decisive turning points of World War II. His reputation was marked by controversy, betrayal, and the unimaginable burden of responsibility for hundreds of thousands of men lost under his command. Yet what he revealed with his dying breath was not the boast of a soldier or the cold calculation of a strategist. It was something far more personal, something no one expected from a man once seen as the very embodiment of military loyalty. His last confession did not just shock those closest to him, it reverberated through history, forcing people to see him in a light they never imagined. What could a man like Paulus possibly admit after years of silence and secrecy? Why did he choose, in his final moments, to unburden himself in a way that would challenge how the world remembered him? And most importantly, what truth did he reveal that still haunts history to this day? To understand the weight of Friedrich Paulus's final confession, one must first return to the defining moment of his life, the winter of 1942, in the ruined city of Stalingrad. Once a rising star within the German military machine, Paulus had been handpicked by Adolf Hitler himself to command the Sixth Army. His reputation was that of a meticulous planner, a man who followed orders with precision, even if he lacked the bold charisma of other field marshals. Yet in Stalingrad, the true test of his character would emerge, and the choices he made, or failed to make, would haunt him until the day he died. The battle was unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. Entire city blocks were reduced to rubble, the frozen Volga River ran red with blood, and both soldiers and civilians endured conditions so horrific that survival seemed impossible. Paulus's Sixth Army, numbering over 250,000 men, pushed deep into the city, but soon found itself surrounded by Soviet forces in a massive encirclement. Supplies ran out, winter tightened its grip, and starvation began to claim as many lives as bullets or bombs. It was during this desperate time that Paulus received a direct order from Hitler. Fight to the last man, no retreat, no surrender. To Hitler, Stalingrad was not merely a military objective. It was a symbol of his own willpower and domination. To Paulus, however, it was a death sentence for his men. Torn between loyalty to his Führer and the growing reality of inevitable destruction, he hesitated, delaying decisions that might have saved lives. Finally, in January 1943, Paulus did what no German field marshal before him had ever done. He surrendered. His decision stunned Hitler, who had promoted him to field marshal just one day earlier, expecting him to commit suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. For the Nazi regime, Paulus's surrender was an act of betrayal. For the soldiers who perished, it was too little, too late. Over 90,000 survivors were marched into Soviet captivity, with only a fraction ever returning home. In the years that followed, Paulus became a complex figure. In Soviet custody, he testified against his former comrades at the Nuremberg trials, condemning the very regime he had once served. He became a symbol of broken loyalty, a man who shifted allegiances when the winds of war turned against him. Some saw him as a coward, others as a pragmatist, and still others as a man crushed beneath the weight of impossible choices. Yet beneath these layers of controversy, there was always something hidden. Those who knew Paulus later in life remarked on his quiet demeanor, his reluctance to speak of Stalingrad, and the haunted look in his eyes whenever the subject arose. He lived with the knowledge that his decisions had cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and though he sought to rebuild his identity after the war, serving as a witness to history, he could never escape the shadow of that brutal winter. This is what made his final confession so powerful. For decades, Paulus avoided direct acknowledgement of his deepest regrets. But as the end of his life drew near, he could no longer remain silent. His last words would not be about Hitler, nor about the Soviet Union, nor about politics. They would be about Stalingrad, and the unbearable truth he had carried with him until the grave. In the years after the war, Friedrich Paulus lived under the shadow of his own choices. Captivity in the Soviet Union had given him time to reflect, and though he cooperated with his captors, even condemning Hitler at Nuremberg, his soul never found peace. To those around him, Paulus was polite and restrained, but there was an air of melancholy that clung to him. The memories of Stalingrad were like ghosts that refused to leave, returning night after night to remind him of the devastation he had overseen. Paulus had been raised as a disciplined soldier, one who believed obedience was the highest virtue. That belief, instilled in him from his earliest days in the military, shaped every decision he made during the war. To defy Hitler outright was unthinkable to him at the time. Yet as the Soviet ring around Stalingrad tightened, Paulus realized the orders he was following were condemning his men to certain death. This was the torment he lived with in the decades that followed. Privately, Paulus admitted to close confidants that he wished he had defied Hitler sooner. The chance to break out of the encirclement had existed early on, but Paulus lacked the nerve to act without explicit approval from Berlin. Thousands of lives might have been spared, but hesitation sealed their fate. His confession was simple yet devastating. He knew he had failed them, and he carried that failure like a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. As he grew older, this regret consumed him more than the hatred of his critics. For Paulus, the condemnation of history was easier to bear than the memory of starving soldiers who had looked to him for salvation. He could still picture their hollow faces, their bodies frozen in the rubble of Stalingrad, their whispered pleas for food and relief. No medals, no titles, and no later testimonies could erase the image of those he left behind. It was this realization that shaped the words he finally chose to speak near the end of his life. By then, Paulus no longer cared about defending his reputation or crafting excuses. What mattered to him was truth, a truth he had withheld for decades. His final words would not be for Hitler or for Germany, but for the men who had died under his command. The confession he revealed on his deathbed shocked those who heard it, not because it was scandalous, but because it was heartbreakingly human. He admitted openly that obedience had destroyed him, that loyalty to a tyrant had silenced the instincts of compassion and reason within him. He confessed that if he had disobeyed, even if it meant his execution, he might have saved countless lives. For the first time, he stripped away the mask of the military commander and revealed the frightened, uncertain man beneath. Those who witnessed this moment described it as a rare glimpse into the soul of a man history had painted only in shades of loyalty and betrayal. Paulus was neither the unflinching servant of Hitler, nor the courageous defector his Soviet captors tried to portray him as. In truth, he was a man torn apart by duty, fear, and regret. His final confession was not an excuse, but an admission that he had chosen wrong, and that history had been written in the blood of his soldiers because of it. This startling honesty would become his legacy in death. And it left a haunting question. What if Paulus had chosen differently when the chance still remained? By the late 1950s, Friedrich Paulus's health began to fail. Years of imprisonment, stress, and a lifetime of carrying unbearable guilt had taken their toll. Living in East Germany after his release from Soviet custody, he spent his last days in Dresden, isolated and largely forgotten by the public. Yet behind closed doors, those close to him knew that the ghosts of Stalingrad never left his side. He rarely spoke of the war in detail, but when he did, his voice grew heavy, as if each word carried the weight of the lives lost under his command. In the summer of 1957, as his illness worsened, Paulus began to reflect openly about the decisions that had defined his legacy. He was no longer the rigid field marshal who once stood in obedience to Hitler's commands. He was a frail man, consumed by the awareness that history had judged him harshly. It was in this vulnerable state that he finally shared the words that would shock those around him. According to accounts from his doctor and a close confidant, Paulus spoke of Stalingrad in his final days with a clarity that startled everyone present. He admitted that the surrender in January 1943 had not been an act of courage, but a desperate choice made too late. Then, with trembling voice, he whispered, "I should have saved them. My men were not meant to be sacrificed for one man's madness. My loyalty destroyed them, and it destroyed me." Those who heard these words realized the depth of his torment. For decades, Paulus had been portrayed as a man of obedience, a commander who chose survival over honor. But in those last moments, his confession reframed the story. It was not cowardice that haunted him most, but obedience itself, his inability to stand against Hitler when it might have mattered. The